finish off the thing about ethnicity, culture, as well as conflict and development in one longer lecture today. All right, taking a look at this map, this shows two things. One, the black boundaries are the states. And like I said, there's 46 different countries in Sub-Saharan Africa. And the red polygons, that's actually ethnic boundaries. And while it's probably not perfect, it shows that there are thousands of different ethnicities in Sub-Saharan Africa. And we'll come back to that when we discuss conflict. And they all have different ways of, different languages, different religions, different foods that they eat, different ways of making a livelihood. So it's a very, very diverse continent. So similarly, there's thousands of different languages. So here are just the main language families. In the north, we see much more Afro-Asiatic, and that would be Arabic. So most of that region is Muslim, as we'll see coming up, and Arabic goes along with Islam. In the orange ones in between up there in the northern part, that's Nilo-Saharan. That's an ancient form of language. It was there before Islam moved in to the northern part of Africa. Then the majority in the middle speak Niger-Congo languages. So you can think about the Niger River and the Congo River basin. And those spread out with agricultural practices and adoptions and spread through much of Sub-Saharan Africa. Now down in the south, we have a couple of different ones. There's three that I'd like to point out. The one that's in purple is Khoisan. And Khoisan is a unique language. It's one where they use clicks in their language. I obviously can't speak it, but it's in the Kalahari Desert, in the Kalahari Bushmen. And so as they speak, they use clicks. I don't know what that means. And then the furthest part in the south, in that kind of greenish or aquamarine, we have an Indo-European languages. That includes English and Afrikaans. Afrikaans is a language that developed, just like we talk about Haitian Creole. The original European settlers that came there were from the Netherlands, so they spoke Dutch. But then over time, it changed and became its own unique language called Afrikaans. And then English, when they later took over, is also a major Indo-European language family there. And then if we look at Madagascar, they speak an Austronesian language, and that comes from Southeast Asia. Just as the Polynesian people went out into the South Pacific, one group sailed the other direction and ended up in Madagascar. And so they speak a language related to those. And I'd point out Swahili. Swahili is very common in East Africa. East Africa. It's a trade language between some Bantu languages and Arabic. And that developed so that people could trade with each other, and then it's become a very commonly used language. Now, in terms of religion, it's also very diverse. You have your original animistic religions. Remember, these are kind of the traditional folk religions of all the different groups. It's not one religion, it's just a kind of a category of religions. And so there's a lot of nature worship, polytheistic, things like that. Now that's disappeared mostly, but it has been blended in, just like we talked about in Latin America, about how some of these religions blend in with the original religions that were there. And so they've blended in terms of into, Protestantism, Catholicism, and is even with Islam. Christianity came early, 300 AD, and a group of people Christians came down into Ethiopia. And today, the majority of people are Coptic Christians or Eastern Orthodox. So it's an old form of Christianity. It's a very Orthodox type. And then later, of course, during the colonial era, Europeans brought in things like Roman Catholicism that you can see in the yellow. In the orange, we see more Protestantism. And that kind of goes along with who the colonial masters were and what they brought with them. But everything that has the hash check in it is one where it's blended together with animism. Islam came in around 1000 AD. And you can see here on the percent or Muslim majorities is in the dark green, and large Muslim minorities is there. And you see that's really in that Sahel region that runs across that belt of Africa. And it goes down across East Africa as well. And some people consider, is this create conflict or does it create peace? Because from the south coming up, you have more Christian and animist groups, and from the north coming down, you have more Muslim groups. And into the middle, they mix. Now, for most communities, it's peace. They get along with their neighbors, everyone respects each other, but from time to time, you can see conflict arise. We'll talk about that with Sudan and South Sudan. Nigeria has problems like that from the north and the south. Burkina Faso has recently had some issues where you have certain groups rise up against the government, and sometimes it has a religious undertone to it. Now, in geopolitics, we think about European colonization. Obviously, the slave trade for 400 years going on. But up until that point, you can see that this is kind of in 1878, European involvement. South Africa was an early one, and there they did have settlers that came across. And that's because that climate is more conducive to them. It's more temperate, doesn't have as many tropical diseases and things of that nature. And so you had migrants coming from the Netherlands and later from England. You have the Portuguese in the brown along the coast, mostly again for trade. We have the French in the green. We have a little bit of Spanish influence. But up until this time, the tropical diseases, especially like malaria, blocked Europeans from colonizing, along with resistance by local populations. It's been noted that half of all Europeans that went to Africa would die within a year because of the tropical diseases that they had no immunities for, and there was no medicines. That changed in the mid 1800s. A drug called quinine, it comes from the bark of a tree from Peru, and it proved to be an anti-malarial drug. And so once quinine was discovered and distributed, Europeans then started colonizing much more wildly and exploring the inland parts of the African continent. Now, as they were exploring, some of these European countries started running into each other as they were exploring the interior of Africa. So in 1884, they got together in Berlin, Germany, and had a conference, aptly called the Berlin Conference. And they sat down with a big map and they divided it up amongst themselves. No Africans were present or had any voices to say in this. So the Europeans just divided it up amongst themselves so they could avoid conflict amongst each other. The British territories, which are in yellow, from like Egypt to Sudan, Kenya, Uganda, some of the southern parts of Africa, and a few other locales, they basically administered their colonies. So they kind of set up this British administrative system. The French, which is in this light green, tried to assimilate populations and make them more French. And then the Belgians were considered bloody. And I put that in quotes because it's not universal, but we'll talk about that in a moment when we discuss Rwanda as well as the Congo. Now, when independence happened after World War II, for the most part, and note that Ethiopia and Liberia were never actually colonized. So those are two countries that weren't officially colonized. But they became independent, most of the countries, from 1957 to 1979, the last one being Zimbabwe, which had to fight for its independence. But those borders, right, they follow much along the colonial borders that were pushed on them by the Europeans. They weren't matched with the local ethnic groups. So when you become independent, who gets to be in control and who gets to, reap the awards of independence? And so what you have is a thing called tribalism. That's where you have more loyalty to your own group than you do to the country. So for here in the United States, we've done a good job of creating nationalism, which means we come from all types of backgrounds, but when you ask who you are, you often say, I'm an American. And we've done that through all kinds of things like propaganda, such as our our flag, our national anthem, all types of things. that breeds nationalism, but that hasn't been the case in many of these countries where their loyalties are actually to their own ethnic group. And so if you get in power, then you give the rewards to those people. And that has led to a lot of conflict over who gets to be in control. You can't blame everything on the Europeans and colonialism, but we can lay some of it there. So let's look at Rwanda. This is a famous one. I'm sure you guys have seen movies about it or had it in classes. Rwanda was a former Belgian colony. And the Belgians, when they ruled it, the Hutus are the majority and the Tutsis are the minority. But they gave power to the Tutsis. They gave out ethnic identity cards and all of these things. And so the Hutus were felt left out. When they became independent, the Hutu majority took control, and then they reversed the oppression on the Tutsis. Now, while they're trying to do a peace deal between the rebel groups, the two groups, somebody killed the president on his way back from Burundi on a peace mission to try to discuss peace. And at that point, the Hutus went out and they performed a genocide on the Tutsis with machetes and hammers and everything you can think of. And it was extremely brutal. In 100 days, over 800,000 people were killed. It finally ended when a Tutsi army came in from the Congo, from the other where they were hanging out, and they were able to defeat the Hutus, and it became the Tutsis became in power. They're doing like peace and reconciliation right now, even to this day, but it has improved. The Congo is very complex, multiple ethnic conflicts. To give a little background, this was a Belgian colony. And during the Berlin Conference, King Leopold of Belgium said, hey, let's try an experiment. We're going to make the free state of the Congo. It's not going to be ruled actually by Belgium or Germany or England. We're going to run it like a corporation. We'll have a board of directors, and it's going to be run like a business. And so they agreed. And of course, King Leopold was on the board of directors. He then quickly fired all of the other directors, and he was the only one, and it became pretty much his personal colony. And a lot of atrocities happened in the Belgian Congo. For example, they would have villages have to meet quotas on how much rubber or ivory they could gather. And if they didn't meet the quotas, then they would chop off hands, chop off feet, rape and pillage, and all of these horrible things. And basically, he reinstated slavery in the Belgian Congo. And there was an anti-slavery league that was led, Mark Twain was a part of that to try to end this. Joseph Conrad, who wrote The Heart of Darkness, he was a riverboat captain in the Congo during this time. And so a lot what he wrote in his book, The Heart of Darkness, comes from his experiences in the Congo. So eventually that ended after King Leopold died, and then they became independent in the late 1950s. However, after independence, the person was a bit of a socialist, so the US supported an army officer who overthrew him, and he became a dictator all the way up until the 1990s, siphoning off the wealth. Once he passed away, his son tried to take power, and then it turned into civil war amongst many different ethnic groups. They believe up to 4 to 6 million people died, which is the highest death toll since World War II, from disease, starvation, and warfare and conflict. Here's a picture on the right from that era of children with their arms and sometimes feet cut off. And with the conflict that's been going on for quite a long time, a lot of landmines and a lot of people, and so they have soccer leagues for amputees. Now they attempted to create a unity government where they had one president and 18 different vice presidents, but that didn't work out too well. So it still has a lot of ethnic conflict and a lot of problems related to all of that. As a side note, one of my friends from grad school, after he got his master's degree in geography, he went and his wife went to work for Catholic Relief Services. That's an aid group. And they went to the Congo, and he was sent out to try to find all the Catholic missions, and they were all destroyed. And those are the ones that provided things like healthcare and education and other things throughout the country. One thing with the Congo, even though it's very poor, it's one of the most mineral rich countries in the world. So there's a lot of foreign investment going in for extraction of materials, of minerals and things. And a lot of the stuff that goes into our cell phones, for example, come from the Congo, as well as diamonds and other things like that. Now, the South Sudan broke away in 2011 from Sudan. The northern part of Sudan are mostly Arabic Muslims, and the south are mostly African animist and Christian groups and tribes. So they fought a long civil war that ended in 2003, and then they had an election in 2011. And by like a 99% vote, they voted to become independent, and they're the newest country in the world. However, after independence, the rival ethnic groups got into a civil war that lasted from 2013 and just ended, I think, in 2020. There's still conflict and tension there, but they went into that. So lots of refugees came out from the South Sudan. And of course, the legacies of all this colonialism and conflict includes lots of displaced people. On this map on the right, it shows refugees, which leave their country and where they're at, and the red dots. And in the blue dots are internally displaced persons. Many people are displaced internally that don't cross borders. And there are huge refugee camps throughout parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, especially in places like Chad and Kenya and Uganda. And it's just a picture of refugees fleeing from conflict. And it's not just humans that are impacted, so is the environment. So here's images that show impact of civil wars in Liberia on the neighboring country of Guinea. Now, there were civil wars also in Sierra Leone and Liberia, and those people fled to Guinea to the refugee camps, including one of my former students, Abdul Sase. So this is Guinea. They call it the Parrot's Beak in 1974. And there it is in 2002 with all the refugees that came in to create refugee camps, needing fuel wood for cooking, etc. So again, before and 2002. So this gave you another personal example. Abdul Sase was one of my students in a geography class. He was one of our majors, and he was playing soccer for Cal Poly, but he was from Sierra Leone. And when he was a teenager, he's a very good soccer player, and he was at a camp, and then the war broke out in Freetown, in the capital. He ran home. His home was burned down. His family was gone. His dad was dead. His uncle was missing arms and told him to flee. So he ran all the way to Guinea and spent 2 years in a refugee camp in Guinea. At some point, somebody saw him playing soccer from the LA Galaxy, and they brought him over to Los Angeles and put him in a community college. And then he came to Cal Poly and played soccer for Cal Poly. And then he eventually found his mom and his sister. And then he moved to LA, and he's a soccer coach there now. But his senior project was with me, and he created an NGO called Give Back to the Children Project, because he still owns his family land in Sierra Leone. And so they put over shipping containers and donated computers and all kinds of learning things to create learning centers for students. And he's still doing that. So, related economic and social development. There's been a lot of failed development policies. A lot of the countries are highly in debt, and they've had to go through those same structural adjustment programs we talked about with the Caribbean, right? Trying to raise revenue and cut spending. So on the bottom is a failed oil refinery. On the top, you can see the infrastructure, just the road networks. During certain parts of the year, the rainy season, they can become impassable. So even traveling is difficult. That's that lack of infrastructure. Industries are not competitive. And there is a lot of corruption and kleptocracy. And that's what kleptocracy is when the rulers steal the money. So looking at per capita GDP, we can see it's the lowest in the world. The southern part is a little bit higher, like South Africa and Botswana, because they have a lot of gold and diamonds, diamond wealth. And South Africa has some industries. Gabon and Equatorial Guinea, right here in West Africa, they have oil wealth offshore. But for the rest of them, it's very low. And here's the UN Human Development Index. Again, the lowest scores are in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we'll look at that in a moment. Things like inflation, we think about that here in the US, but very high in some of these places. This is in Zimbabwe, and it's a $100 trillion note because their currency was devalued so much that, it's probably worth $10. So looking at the Human Development Index, and I kind of ordered it. I included Switzerland, Singapore, the US. The highest scoring one in Sub-Saharan Africa is South Africa, and it only comes in at 109. You can see the life expectancy is a bit lower. The gross national income per capita is not very high. And we're not going to go through every one of them, but you can see all the way down this list. Rwanda, 165. And then we continue at the bottom of the list with the South Sudan coming in last place. Life expectancy, not much schooling, and GNI per capita is only 768. So you can see there's a lot of room for improvement, whether it's education, health, and also just their economies. Another fact that's important for this is the Gini coefficient, and that's the measure of inequality in a country. So the highest one that scores the highest in the world is South Africa, meaning the highest 10% of their population has over half the wealth, whereas the lowest 10% has less than 1% of the wealth. And as we go down here, we have Namibia, Botswana, Central African Republic, Zambia, Lesotho, Swaziland, Rwanda, Guinea-Bissau, Kenya. So these are the ones that have the worst inequalities. And we saw that in South America and Latin America in general, but Sub-Saharan Africa is even higher. In terms of agriculture, the majority are subsistence farmers, growing things like millet, sorghum, and corn. And there are pastoralists like the Maori people. And here they are draining blood out of the cow's neck. I may have misspoken on that name of the group. They're in Kenya. Another problem is failed at food policies. For example, early on, when they became independent and even up to sometimes in the present day, they wanted to keep food prices low for people in urban areas. So they limited how much you could charge for your crops. Well, that day gave no incentive for farmers to grow those crops. So instead of growing crops for subsistence, they would focus on plantation cash crops because that was where the market was for export. So things like tea, coffee, peanuts, cotton is a big one, rubber, cocoa for chocolate. And you can see on this index here on the left-hand side, this is production between 1984 and 1996. And you can see in almost every case it went down except for Ghana. So the food they produced became less than they used to. And cereal donations also, for the most part, also went down, except for like Rwanda because of the conflict. One thing they do have a lot of is mineral wealth. There's a lot of oil in West Africa, especially in Nigeria, Angola, and Gabon. And this little one, Equatorial Guinea. Diamonds are big in Sub-Saharan Africa. South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia down here in the far south. And then in Sierra Leone and Congo and Angola. And sometimes they call these conflict diamonds during the civil wars. because the different groups would go out and get those diamonds and they'd sell them, and that would fund the wars themselves. And then resources for electronics, some of those rare earth minerals that go into our electronics. A lot of those come from parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, such as the Central African Republic and the Congo. Now that's another big issue, and this is what's going to be coming up for your flip discussion this week, is aid versus investment. So on the right-hand side, we see a map that shows aid as a percent of the gross national income. And in the dark red, it's 20% or more of their economy comes from aid, international aid. But you can see that foreign investment, and that's not aid, that's actually investing in things like factories, roads, things of that nature, mines, has risen quite a bit from 1995 to 2016, from 4.5 billion to 54 billion. So countries are really starting to come into Sub-Saharan Africa, focusing mainly on looking at resources like the minerals, the wealth, etc., as well as even land. So it's very extractive still. And then there's the issue about international aid and donations. Do they help or do they not? And that's going to be an important thing for your flip discussion, is what I want you to think about. On the left is food aid that's coming in to places that it might be, having a famine coming on, a scarcity of food. And on the right are those bundles of clothes that we donate to like Goodwill or the Salvation Army. Much of it gets bundled up, put on a ship, arrives at a port in Africa, and local vendors will buy them and then take them to the market and then sell them for cheap. The problem with this is this often undercuts any local t-shirt makers, local clothes makers, because they can't, it costs them more to do it. And so that's one issue that people say about donations, is that obviously it's needed when times of famine, but other types could actually hurt the economy itself, the local economy. And this here just shows Chinese investment going into Sub-Saharan Africa. The Chinese are heavily involved, and they're looking for access to resources for the most part. And they're building ports and roads and mines. The US is starting to, but many other countries are doing much more in terms of investment. All right, so this is the end of this lecture for World Regions. We'll have a few more lectures for next week, just as the course conclusions and a few things like that, as you guys prepare for write your papers and prepare for the final exam. For this week's flip discussion, and I will put something on flip for you as well, you're gonna watch a short, I think it's about 10 minutes, so it's not that long, and it's a video that's on Canvas, and it's called Dead Aid. And what I want you guys to do is see if you agree with this person about how she views aid versus foreign investment. There's no right answer. I just want to see your views and what you think. Is it, do you agree? Do you disagree? And what do you think should be done to help Sub-Saharan Africa? All right, thank you.